A discussion recently caught my attention on Reddit. The topic was unpaid overtime in visual effects industry. Now, whenever a story like this appears, the reactions are always predictable. Some artists immediately say, if you work the hours, you deserve the money. Others respond, hold on, what if those extra hours happened because the artist wasn't efficient enough? And just like that, the conversation turns into a battle between artist and management. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something. This isn't actually a simple debate. In fact, this might be one of the biggest gray areas in the entire VFX industry because depending on how you look at it, both sides have a point, and that's why I want to talk about it today. Not who is right, not who is wrong, but why does this argument keep happening over and over again? So let's start with artist perspective. Friday evening, the delivery is on Monday. The client has sent more notes. You stay late, maybe until 10 p.m., maybe midnight, sometimes the entire weekend. At the end of the process, the most artists would say something very simple: I worked those hours. And honestly, that was hard to argue against. Time is one of the most valuable things we have right now. If somebody spends their evening working instead of being with their family, they naturally expect a compensation, especially when the work is directly benefiting the company. Many artists also point out something important because artists rarely control schedule, budgets, and negotiate client expectations. They are often the people absorbing the consequences when those decisions go wrong. A project gets underbid, a client changes the creative direction, and the schedule becomes tighter and sometimes impossible. And suddenly, artists are expected to solve the problems with their personal extra hours. From that perspective, overtime compensation feels completely reasonable. In fact, many would argue it's a bare minimum. But then there is the other side, and this is where the discussion becomes uncomfortable. Let's imagine two compositors receive the same shot, same task, and same deadline with the same resource. One artist finishes at 6 p.m. and other artist stays until 11 p.m. Should the second artist automatically receive 5 hours of overtime? A lot of managers would say no. Their argument is simple. Companies don't pay for time alone, they pay for the results. If overtime becomes automatic regardless of performance, then inefficiency becomes expensive. And here's the part nobody likes to talk about. Not every overtime hour is created equally. Sometimes overtime happens because the workload is unreasonable, but sometimes overtime also happens because somebody lacks experience. Sometimes they struggle with the task. Sometimes they make mistakes and requires a rework. Sometimes they simply slower than they expected for their level. That doesn't make them as a bad artist. It does create a difficult question. Should a company pay extra because somebody needs more time than the role normally requires? It's not a comfortable question, but a practical one. Now, here is where I think both sides start making a mistake because both sides are usually arguing about hours when they should be arguing about causes. The number of overtime hours doesn't actually tell us very much. Imagine an artist worked 20 hours of overtime on a month. What does actually tell us? Almost nothing. Maybe the show was underbid or client requested many creative changes. The department was understaffed. The pipeline issue, the technical issue, the artist was learning, the artist was sometimes struggling. Maybe the management keep changing the priorities. Maybe all those things happened simultaneously. The overtime itself only the symptom. The real story is what caused it. Can we actually tell the difference between overtime caused by bad planning or overtime caused by poor performance? And this is where visual effects become different from many industries. In manufacturing, measuring productivity is relatively straightforward. In VFX, it's much harder. For example, a compositor finishes shots in 2 hours and another one takes 8 hours. At the first glance, the answer seems obvious. The first compositor is most efficient, and the except maybe not. Maybe the second compositor discovered a problem nobody else noticed. Maybe they built a more robust setup. They put their own creative thoughts and to the task. Maybe they prevented the issues that would have appeared later. Maybe they were working so much harder for the version of the shot, improving the quality. Sometimes they were also helping other artists throughout the day. The reality is creative work is messy. Productivity isn't always visible, And that's one of the reasons this conversation become more emotional, because neither side has a perfect documented information. Something else rarely get discussed is responsibility. Who owns the overtime? Let's think about that question. Who actually owns it? If a company knowingly accepts an impossible schedule and the artist accepts it and start the work, who actually owns the overtime? If a client keeps adding the notes without extending deadlines, who owns the overtime? If a production team understaffs the show, or there is a pipeline or a technical issue, who owns the overtime? But on the other hand, if an artist consistently takes twice as long as everyone on a similar work, who owes the overtime then? The answer isn't always the company and it isn't always the artist, which is the main reason exactly why these kind of debates never seem to end. I think the biggest problem is that we often treat overtime as a moral issue. We immediately start looking for villains: a greedy studio, a lazy artist, or a bad manager, or an entitled employee, less skilled employee. But in reality, usually far more boring than that. Most overtime in VFX caused by a chain reaction. A schedule that's slightly too aggressive, a bid is slightly too low, and a client slightly too demanding, and an artist who has less skill and still learning, a supervisor who have tried to protect the quality, and the production team trying to hit a deadline, and nobody individually causes the problem, yet everybody is contributes to it. In VFX, speed and value are not always the same thing. Sometimes the fastest artist creates technical depth. Sometimes the slowest artist prevent disasters. Sometimes an artist appears inefficient because they are carrying the hardest work, and sometimes they are genuinely struggling. The difficult part from the outside is all of the situations can look exactly the same. That's why I get uncomfortable when people use the word efficiency as if it is as an objective measurement, because in creative work efficiency is often much harder to measure than people think. And if we can't accurately measure the productivity, then how can we accurately determine whether the overtime is caused by poor performance or by the nature of the work itself? That's the question I keep coming back to. Not the whether the overtime has happened, but why it was actually happened. So I don't think the question should be should overtime would be paid, because if somebody is required to work extra hours for business reason, the answer is usually yes. Every overtime story has a separate context, and without that context, we usually judging based on incomplete information. That's why this debate never goes away. Not because one side is right and other side is wrong, because the truth lives somewhere in uncomfortable space between them. And in VFX, that gray area is often bigger than we'd like to admit. What do you think? When overtime happens, who owns the responsibility? The artist, the studio, or is the answer somewhere in between? Thank you for watching. Subscribe to topicroombfs.com.